My parents kicked me out at 16 so my older sister could move back in with her boyfriend. It's always been obvious that my parents never loved me, but it wasn't until last week, when I turned 16, that I finally got some hardcore evidence. It started off with business as usual, zero celebration, zero cake. But then, they actually surprised me with a gift. Except it wasn't for me, it was for them. They kicked me out of the house. The reason? My older sister Natalie. She's basically their golden child, and always has been. They've never said why, but I'm socially awkward, and never had a girlfriend. Meanwhile, she was the it girl back in high school. But now she's 8 months pregnant, and on my birthday morning, my parents woke me up and told me to start packing. You see, we have 4 bedrooms, and they wanted one for the newborn, one for my sister, and one for her boyfriend. At my expense, of course, so I was being booted to my uncle's house. I didn't even react, and after a few minutes of silence, they promised to cover all my expenses until I turned 18, as long as it wasn't under their roof anymore. Natalie wasn't even home during this conversation, and I immediately knew that was intentional, so she wouldn't have to witness this train wreck and feel guilty. I thought we had a civil relationship. But at that moment, I knew my family never actually cared about me, and she was no exception. And like any 16-year-old boy being told they're getting kicked out on their birthday, I felt crushed. But I knew nothing I could possibly say would make them actually love me, and that's why I spent my 16th birthday stuffing all my belongings into trash bags. They helped me pack, but honestly, I think they were just speeding up my exit. Once finished, they even drove me to my uncle's place and chatted happily the entire trip. At one point, my mom turned to my dad with a huge smile plastered on her face. "Hey, now that OP's gone, we can finally order some Indian food." When we arrived, I expected some sort of goodbye hug, or even a good luck, but instead, they pulled into the sidewalk and drove off before I even made it to the front door. And when my uncle opened the door, I felt even worse, because he wrapped his arms around me and warmly welcomed me in. I broke down crying, because the whole thing made me realize how terrible my parents actually are. I ended up opening up to him, and he seemed completely shocked by what I said and asked me to repeat everything. So I recounted the morning's events, and his friendly smile instantly transformed into an angry scowl. Without saying anything, he grabbed his phone, mentioned needing to make a call, and disappeared into another room. Suddenly, my uncle's voice erupted through the walls. This was completely out of character since he rarely raises his voice at anyone. He's generally super chill and soft-spoken. I immediately knew someone had seriously pissed him off for him to react this intensely. When he returned, his face was bright red with anger, and I discovered my parents were the source of his fury. Turns out, my dad, his brother, had told him that I'd actually proposed this living arrangement myself, and I was totally cool with moving out of my childhood home to live with him instead. This explained why my uncle had agreed to take me in, since he thought it was my idea. After that call, he grabbed me a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. He told me he was sorry for not doing something sooner. He said my parents are the adults in the situation, and my safety and happiness should have always been their priority. I felt myself choke up and sniffle to hold back tears when he said that. They were the words I've been longing to hear ever since I was 6, and my parents told me I was worthless for the first time. But his reassurance wasn't enough for me. My parents had literally chosen to give their guest room to Natalie's boyfriend, who's like 24, with a steady job and an apartment lease. So I decided to expose my parents online and let the internet deal with them. I wasn't sure if my uncle would approve, so I waited until he went for his afternoon nap and posted what had happened without hesitation. I included everything: the favoritism, the insults, and of course, the borderline abandonment. By the time I hit post, tears were streaming down my face. I immediately turned my phone off because I was terrified of the consequences. And when I turned on my phone an hour later, I finally learned why people always say, be careful what you post online, because it went viral, but to all the wrong people. The post had been seen by tons of relatives, and my inbox was flooded with messages from my parents and even my sister. Meanwhile, numerous family members had commented expressing their support. Several had texted offering help if I needed anything at all. That felt uplifting until I read my parents' messages, all filled with rage and hostility. Obviously, they were furious about what I'd shared and demanded I delete the post immediately. My dad said horrible things, even writing that he wished I'd never been born. Painful, but not surprising. My mom's messages were similarly nasty, while my sister's stood out as different. She didn't say much except requesting to speak with me in person if possible. I felt completely overwhelmed by all the responses and just put my phone away again, ignoring everyone for the next couple days. However, I did block my parents since I had zero interest in communicating with them anymore. I knew they were legally obligated to support me financially until I turned 18, and beyond that, I saw no reason to maintain contact. And that's when my uncle finally woke up from his nap. He rushed into the living room where I'd been sitting since arriving and calmly asked if I'd posted something online. After showing him everything, he seemed fine with this approach. And if my dad tried reaching him in the following days, he never mentioned it to me, because we carried on like nothing happened, which confirmed he supported my actions completely. That was all the validation I needed or wanted. For about a week, I had virtually no interaction with my parents, but then they suddenly appeared outside my school as I was leaving, looking absolutely livid. My friends were fully aware of the situation, so they formed a protective barrier around me so I wouldn't have to engage if I didn't want to, but they kept shouting my name until I finally responded. I marched straight up to them and declared I wanted nothing to do with them anymore, but they completely ignored that and insisted I needed to come home with them immediately. I couldn't understand why they suddenly wanted me back when they'd made it crystal clear I wasn't important to them at all. It felt like a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation among relatives, so I refused to go anywhere until they explained what was happening. Trying to understand this abrupt change in attitude, they seemed simultaneously furious, yet determined to bring me home. home. When they said they didn't want my friends overhearing, I told my buddies to step back so we could talk privately. Once my friends were out of earshot, they revealed they needed me back because I wasn't responding to their calls or texts, and they had to reconcile with me to secure their inheritance. After my post went viral in our family, my grandparents had discovered everything. My dad's parents are seriously wealthy, and they threatened him that continuing to treat me this way would cost him his inheritance. They'd stated that unless my parents reconciled with me, treated me better, and ensured I felt loved and cared for, whatever my father was supposed to inherit would go to my uncle instead, since he was taking care of me without obligation. My dad couldn't afford losing this inheritance. We're talking serious money here. My parents earn decent combined incomes themselves, but honestly, in their position, I'd probably want that inheritance too. The difference is, I would have had enough sense not to make it seem like they were doing me a favor by taking me back, because this wasn't about me at all, just their own financial interests. Even then, they lacked the basic intelligence to at least pretend they genuinely wanted me home, so I told them I couldn't care less about their inheritance, and walked away without listening to another word, ignoring their shouts as I left. I caught the bus back to my uncle's place and described the school confrontation, which annoyed him too. To prevent future incidents, he's contacted his attorney about changing my custody arrangement. Legally, my parents still have rights over me, and that needs changing if I'm going to permanently live with my uncle. I also called my grandparents to thank them for intervening, but explained I genuinely didn't want to return to my parents, because after just a few days with my uncle, I finally felt free for the first time. Living with my parents had been suffocating, and despite constantly hoping things would improve, they never did. My grandparents live in a different state, so we rarely meet, but during family gatherings and holidays, my parents always behaved perfectly, so my grandparents never witnessed how I was treated at home. It wasn't outright cruelty, but constant indifference and dismissal. Everything appeared normal superficially, but anyone spending a few days with us would notice how they basically pretended I didn't exist, while focusing entirely on my sister. After her pregnancy, it worsened dramatically, and I became completely invisible. I explained all this to my grandparents, who assured me that if living with my uncle was what I wanted, they'd make it happen. If my parents surrendered their rights, my grandparents would ensure all my needs were covered. I felt optimistic after that conversation because things were finally improving, but that didn't last long when I received an email from my dad several hours later. It wasn't hateful or cruel, just disappointingly manipulative. He claimed I shouldn't have publicly posted about the situation when my grandparents would have heard about it anyway through my uncle. Now, beyond my grandparents' anger, they faced massive backlash from relatives and social isolation, which he considered unfair. He mentioned some colleagues discovered the post since it appeared in their feeds when he was tagged. This created problems at his workplace, and according to him, my actions caused unnecessary drama in their lives. So AIT for posting about how my parents forced me out on my 16th birthday to give my pregnant sister's baby my bedroom. Update 1. Before sharing what happened next, thank you everyone for taking time to comment on my post. Your supportive words mean everything to me right now. Addressing questions about why I hadn't left before and waited for them to kick me out, especially with my grandparents and uncle willing to help. The truth is, I wasn't treated with outright cruelty. Like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't actively abused, just consistently ignored and treated as unwanted. That's definitely a form of mistreatment. But in my mind, I was grateful I wasn't being physically hurt or verbally attacked. I had shelter and food, so I convinced myself I was fine and didn't need to feel loved or valued. I'd normalized the neglect so completely that I didn't even recognize it as abnormal anymore. As for why I never reached out to extended family for help, I honestly didn't want to burden anyone. I constantly worried about what would happen if they refused, and my parents discovered I'd asked. That would have made my home situation way worse, since my folks are obsessed with appearances. That's why I kept everything bottled up and suffered quietly. My uncle never offered to take me in because he didn't want to offend my parents, plus he wasn't sure I'd even want to live with him. So while this didn't happen earlier, the way things unfolded organically probably worked out better in the end. It came late, but hey, better late than never, right? He's currently working with a lawyer to transfer custody rights to him, which is going to be a massive battle now that inheritance money is involved. But even if this goes to court, my grandparents and uncle have promised to back me completely. My uncle's been super apologetic since I arrived because he's finally realized how neglected I was at home and feels terrible for never addressing it because he thought it wasn't his place to interfere. At least everything's out in the open now with my family, and I'm feeling more hopeful about my future. Now, about my sister Natalie. In my original post, I mentioned she texted asking to meet in person, but I ignored her message because I didn't know how to respond. She'd never been directly cruel to me. She just adopted our parents' distant behavior. Throughout my life, she remained aloof, but on the rare occasions we did interact, she was generally pleasant. I assumed the whole kick me out for her boyfriend and baby plan was her idea, which felt like she was finally showing her true colors by actively harming me, so I ghosted her message completely. Our relationship was always awkward and tense, but I still preferred her to our parents, since she'd at least be decent whenever we actually spoke. It wasn't her fault our parents favored her so obviously. So 3 days ago, when she texted again asking me to visit, I decided to call and ask why she wanted to see me. I refused to go back to my parents' house where I assumed she'd be, but surprisingly, she told me she was staying at her boyfriend's apartment. She wasn't feeling well enough to go out due to the pregnancy, so she asked if I'd come over to discuss everything happening with our family. She mentioned having several important things to tell me face to face. Out of pure curiosity, I decided to visit. When I arrived, she immediately apologized for never defending me, even though she clearly knew our parents played favorites and consistently dismissed me. They constantly ignored my achievements while celebrating hers, and I was transparently the unwanted child, but she never tried fixing that. She admitted she just felt too uncomfortable confronting our parents, so she let it continue. Since I seemed to be handling the treatment okay, she felt less responsible to speak up. Now she realized how messed up the whole situation was and genuinely wanted to make amends. She also revealed that our parents never discussed the living arrangements with her at all. She was completely blindsided learning they'd kicked me out to accommodate her baby and boyfriend, claiming she had absolutely no idea this had happened. She never requested any such arrangement. Her actual plan was to stay with our parents only until the baby was a couple months old before moving in with her boyfriend. She'd wanted to move out sooner, but stayed solely because our parents begged her to. However, after reading my post, she realized she couldn't continue enabling their behavior and moved out within a week. This sparked a massive fight with our parents, who insisted she was making a terrible decision. They're currently not even speaking because they accused her of being ungrateful and selfish, none of which is true since she never promised them anything. They just made assumptions. So all that drama was ultimately pointless since my parents ended up losing both their kids. At least she apologized for being a crappy sister and person generally, which I forgave because holding on to bitterness wasn't going to help me heal. We cleared the air completely, and she promised the same thing my uncle did, that from now on, she'd always have my back no matter what. It's been just under a week since my original post, and I've heard nothing from my parents since that email, so I'm guessing they've finally given up trying to get me back. I'm pretty sure my grandparents intervened since they called midweek to assure me my parents wouldn't bother me at school or send more emails. I hadn't even mentioned Dad's email to them, so clearly there must have been some conversation between my parents and grandparents behind the scenes. I don't know exactly what was discussed, but it seems my parents have finally accepted defeat. Update 2. Only 3 days since my last update, and today my uncle announced my parents have agreed to surrender their parental rights. The paperwork should be completed soon, and he'll officially take over legal custody. I'm experiencing seriously mixed emotions right now. On one hand, I'm thrilled to finally have a home where I don't constantly feel unwanted and irrelevant, but I'm also feeling strangely empty and melancholic about certain aspects. It feels surreal that this is actually happening, but ultimately, this is the right path forward. This is exactly what I needed. Update 3. Hey everyone. A couple weeks have passed since my uncle officially became my legal guardian. Major win. I also discovered my parents only relinquished custody because after I told my grandparents I refused to return home, they presented my parents with an ultimatum: lose their entire inheritance, or keep 50% of what they were originally going to receive, but give up custody, and promise never to contact me again without my permission. Guess which option my parents chose? LMAO. Not surprised whatsoever, and honestly, I couldn't care less because it just confirms I dodged a major bullet. Good riddance. I'm still regularly talking with my sister though. My parents are desperately trying to reconcile with her before her due date, but she's demanding personal space right now, and has told them to stop hounding her daily. At this point, I can't help but laugh at the absolute dumpster fire they've created for our family, but whatever. I'm happy living with my uncle, and that's all that matters to me now.